The night they came for her horse, Ellie Whitaker stood alone at the fence with a lantern in one trembling hand and her father's old rifle resting against her hip. 23 men rode toward her through the freezing darkness, their torches casting wild shadows across the snow-dusted pasture. Marcus Caldwell led them, his face hard as stone rifle laid across his saddle like a promise of violence. Behind Ellie, in the vast darkness, Ghost breathed that deep, powerful exhale she had come to know better than her own heartbeat. "Hand over the horse, Ellie," Marcus called out, his voice cutting through the wind, "or we'll take him ourselves." The distant howling of wolves rolled down from the ridges closer than ever. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs, but she lifted her chin and stood her ground. At 29 years old, she had already buried her father and learned to run this ranch alone. She would not surrender the one creature who had stood by her through it all. Willow Ridge Valley had always looked like a painting from the high passes, rolling amber pastures, cut by a silver creek, thin smoke rising from ranch houses against bruised purple sunsets. But those who lived here knew the truth. The land was beautiful and unforgiving. Winters arrived early and lingered like grudges. Prosperity was never guaranteed. It had to be fought for every single day. Ellie Whitaker had been fighting that battle alone for 4 years, ever since her father's heart failed one brutal January night. She managed a modest sheep operation with quiet determination. Her flock was healthy. Her fences were repaired. She survived. But in a valley where survival was never enough, her independence made her an outsider in the eyes of many. And then there was Ghost. 2 years earlier, on a warm autumn afternoon, Ellie had found the massive Mustang trapped in a deep ravine, badly injured from a fall. His steel-gray coat was matted with blood, one hind leg twisted at a terrible angle. Most ranchers would have put a bullet in him. Ellie climbed down instead. For weeks, she nursed him in the barn, speaking softly, offering patience instead of force. Ghost had slowly healed, and in return, he had become something extraordinary, a guardian who protected her flock with fierce intelligence and loyal presence. Wolves stayed away from her land. The sheep remained safe. That was exactly why the valley feared him. The wolf attacks had started in late autumn. Tracks first, then devastating losses. The Harshaw Ranch lost 31 sheep in one night. Grace Thompson's flock was nearly wiped out. Panic spread like poison. Marcus Caldwell, the wealthiest and most powerful rancher in Willow Ridge, called meetings and brought in hunters. He spoke of a coordinated threat that needed to be eliminated. What he really wanted was control. Young Caleb Bennett, only 19, had ridden over 3 days earlier with a warning. He had stood at her gate, twisting his hat nervously in his hands. "They're blaming Ghost," he said. "Marcus is turning everyone against him." Now those fears had become torches and rifles in the freezing night. Ellie faced the approaching riders without flinching. The lantern light painted her face with warm gold against the cold darkness. She wore her father's heavy coat, the sleeves too long, but it gave her courage. "You know why we're here," Marcus said, stopping his horse just beyond her gate. "Your flock is untouched while the rest of us are bleeding out. That horse of yours is unnatural, dangerous." Ghost emerged from the shadows behind Ellie like a silver phantom. The moment he appeared, several horses panicked and reared. One rider nearly fell. Even Marcus's Stallion backed away sharply. The big Mustang stood tall, muscles rippling beneath his steel-gray coat, his dark eyes fixed on the men with calm, unshakable power. Ellie placed one hand on Ghost's warm neck. "He's not the problem," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "He's the only reason my sheep are still alive." The wind howled down from the mountains again, carrying another chorus of wolf howls, closer this time. The men shifted uneasily. Marcus's jaw tightened, but for the first time that night, doubt flickered across his face. "This isn't over, Ellie," he warned before turning his horse. The group slowly retreated into the darkness, their torches fading like dying stars. Ellie remained at the fence long after they left, her hand still resting on Ghost's neck. The big horse lowered his head and gently nudged her shoulder as if offering comfort. She leaned into him, feeling the solid strength that had become her anchor. "We'll face whatever comes," she whispered. But even as the words left her lips, she knew the real storm was only beginning. The wolves were growing bolder. Marcus was determined to break her, and the people of Willow Ridge, frightened and divided, would soon be forced to choose sides. From the shadows of the tree line, Caleb Bennett watched the scene unfold, his young heart heavy with worry for Ellie, and with the first quiet stirrings of something deeper he didn't yet understand. Ghost lifted his head and looked toward the ridge as if already sensing the battles yet to come. The morning after the confrontation, Ellie Whitaker stood at her kitchen window watching pale light creep across the frost-covered pasture. Her hands gripped a warm mug of coffee, but sleep had barely touched her the night before. Outside, Ghost moved along the northern fence line with his usual powerful grace, his steel-gray coat catching the weak sunlight like polished metal. She had known the valley's fear would turn against her eventually, but seeing 23 men ready to take Ghost by force had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Ghost had become far more than a guardian for her sheep. In the lonely years after her father's death, he had become her closest companion. A soft knock came at the gate just after breakfast. Caleb Bennett stood there looking tired and uncertain, his breath visible in the cold air. "I wanted to check on you," he said, "after last night." Ellie studied the young man for a moment. At 19, Caleb still carried the awkwardness of youth, but there was a sincerity in his eyes that set him apart from most in the valley. She opened the gate. "Come inside. There's fresh coffee." They sat across from each other at the old wooden table. Caleb kept glancing out the window toward Ghost. "He was incredible last night," Caleb said quietly. "The way he stood there. I've never seen a horse like him." Ellie smiled faintly. "Most people see a wild Mustang and think danger. They don't understand what he's become." In the days that followed, Caleb began coming by more often. At first, he offered practical help repairing a broken fence rail hauling hay when the wind made the chore difficult. But Ellie noticed how his eyes always drifted to Ghost. The young man was both fascinated and a little afraid of the powerful horse. One crisp afternoon, as thin sunlight broke through the clouds, Caleb approached Ghost slowly in the pasture. Ellie watched from the barn door. Caleb moved with patience, speaking softly, offering an apple from his coat pocket. Ghost watched him warily, at first ears flicking, then stepped forward and gently took the fruit. The moment felt sacred. "He doesn't trust easily," Ellie said later as they walked the fence line together. Ghost followed a few paces behind them. "Neither do you," Caleb replied with a small smile, "but you trusted him." Their conversations grew longer and more personal as autumn deepened. Caleb spoke of the heavy responsibility he felt helping his family's ranch, while his older brother Jacob made most decisions. Ellie shared the quiet grief that still lived in her after losing her father, the long nights when the ranch felt too big and the silence too heavy. Ghost had been the one steady presence that kept her going. Meanwhile, the wolf attacks worsened. Grace Thompson lost more sheep. Old Sam Hargrove found his guard dogs unwilling to leave the porch. Fear spread like frost across the valley. Marcus Caldwell held more meetings, his voice growing louder, his influence tightening. Ellie rode out one afternoon to visit old Harlan Whitaker, her father's old friend who lived in a small cabin near the eastern ridge. The elderly man listened carefully as she described the growing pressure. "Marcus has been weaving his web for years," Harlan said, pouring her bitter coffee. "Those loan agreements he offers look fair on paper, but the fine print gives him control over water rights and access roads. He's waiting for a season bad enough to break people. This winter might be exactly what he needs." When Ellie returned home, Caleb was waiting with troubling news. He had secretly examined his family's agreement with Marcus and discovered dangerous clauses. "I don't want us to lose everything because we were too scared to look closer," he told her, voice low with worry. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains in streaks of purple and gold, Ellie and Caleb stood together near the corral. Ghost approached them on his own, lowering his large head so Caleb could stroke his neck. The young man's touch was gentle, full of quiet wonder. "You're doing something brave," Ellie said softly. "Coming here, helping me when the whole valley is turning against Ghost." Caleb looked at her, his expression earnest. "Being here doesn't feel brave. It feels right, the way you saved him, the way you fight for this land, the way you trust. It makes me want to be better, to stand for something real." For a moment their shoulders brushed, neither moved away. Ghost stood quietly beside them, as if giving his silent approval. Ellie felt something warm stir in her chest, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. But the howling in the distance reminded her that peace was fragile. The wolves were growing bolder, Marcus was becoming more dangerous, and the people of Willow Ridge were being forced to choose between fear and hope. Ellie knew the real fight was coming. Tomorrow she would begin reaching out to the other ranchers, especially the women who had suffered the most. She would show them what she was beginning to see clearly, that strength wasn't only found in power or wealth. Sometimes it was found in patience, in trust, and in the quiet bond between a woman, a wild horse, and a young man brave enough to stand with them. Ghost lifted his head and gazed toward the darkening ridges as if already sensing the battle still ahead. The wind carried another distant howl, but this time Ellie did not feel entirely alone. The full moon hung low and bright over Willow Ridge Valley, casting a cold silver light across the snow-dusted pastures. Ellie had felt the tension building for days. Wolves hunted more boldly under the full moon, and tonight the air itself felt electric with danger. She had moved the flock into the barn early, reinforced every gate, and checked the fences twice. Ghost stayed close, his powerful body tense, ears constantly flicking toward the northern ridges. She sat by the kitchen window with her father's rifle across her lap, lantern turned low. The silence outside was unnerving. Then it started, distant howling near Marcus Caldwell's large operation. Soon the sounds of chaos reached her, panicked shouts, gunshots, and the terrified bleating of sheep. Marcus's ranch was under heavy attack. Ellie pulled on her coat and stepped into the freezing night. Ghost moved beside her like a silver shadow as they crossed the pasture. Her breath clouded in the air. When they reached the northern fence line, 6 large wolves emerged from the tree line. Their eyes glowed green-gold in the moonlight. The lead male, broad-chested and dark-striped, stepped forward boldly. Ghost didn't hesitate. He reared up with a powerful neigh that shattered the night, then charged forward. His steel-gray body moved with astonishing speed and strength. The wolves scattered at first, but the largest one stood its ground. Ghost reared again, hooves flashing, his wild Mustang spirit fully awake. The sound of his hooves and fierce cries echoed across the valley. One by one, the wolves retreated, disappearing back into the trees. Ellie's heart pounded as she ran to Ghost. She pressed her face against his warm neck, tears freezing on her cheeks. "You saved us," she whispered. "You held the line." They were still standing together when riders began arriving at her fence. Caleb was the first, riding hard, his face pale with worry. Behind him came Sam Hargrove, Grace Thompson, and several other ranchers drawn by the noise. Marcus Caldwell arrived last, his coat open and his expression haunted. His ranch had suffered devastating losses. The group gathered in the moonlight, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. Caleb dismounted quickly and came to stand beside Ellie. Without thinking, he reached out and took her hand. The touch was warm and steady, grounding her in the middle of the chaos. "They came here too?" Sam asked. "They tried," Ellie replied. "Ghost drove them back." Marcus stared at the big Mustang for a long moment. The same horse he had demanded be removed now stood as living proof of something powerful protecting this land. The silence that followed was heavy. Grace Thompson spoke first, her voice trembling but determined. "We can't keep losing everything like this. We're being picked apart one ranch at a time." "Amiya." Ellie looked at the gathered faces. "Then we stop facing this alone. Come to my house at first light. We need to talk about more than wolves. We need to talk about how this valley survives." Marcus met her eyes across the fence. For the first time, the powerful man looked truly shaken. He gave a slow nod. "At dawn," he said. As the others began to leave, Caleb stayed behind. He helped Ellie check the barn and make sure the flock was calm. When the work was done, they stood together near the house under the fading moonlight. Ghost watched over them from a short distance. "I was terrified tonight," Caleb admitted softly. "Not just for the sheep, for you." Ellie turned to him. In the moonlight, his face looked older, more resolute. "So was I. But Ghost reminded me what matters. And you coming here, standing with us, it means everything." Caleb took a small step closer. "Ellie, the way you saved Ghost, the way you fight for this land, the way you trust, it's changed how I see everything. I don't want to just survive anymore. I want to build something real here." His voice dropped. "With you." The words hung gently between them. Ellie felt warmth bloom in her chest, pushing back the fear of the long night. She didn't pull away when Caleb's fingers brushed her cheek. It was a quiet, honest moment, the beginning of something tender and true, born from shared danger and the gentle bridge of a remarkable horse. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "we fight for the whole valley." Caleb nodded. Together. He rode home reluctantly as the moon began to set. Ellie remained outside a while longer, her hand resting on Ghost's strong neck. The big Mustang lowered his head and nuzzled her shoulder, as if sensing the new emotions stirring in her heart. She looked out over the darkened pastures and felt the weight of what lay ahead. Difficult conversations. Old contracts that needed to be challenged, and a community that had to learn to stand united. But for the first time in many months, Ellie did not feel alone. A young man with a brave heart had stepped into her life, guided by the powerful and loyal spirit of a wild horse. Ghost lifted his head and gazed toward the ridges, as if already preparing for the battle still to come. The wind carried one final distant howl, but this time it sounded farther away. Dawn would bring the real test. But tonight, under the quiet moonlight, something new and hopeful had taken root in Willow Ridge Valley. The morning light filled Ellie's kitchen as neighbors gathered around the old wooden table. Mugs of hot coffee steamed in the cold air, while Marcus Caldwell's lawyer spread papers across the surface. Sam Hargrove, Grace Thompson, Jacob and Caleb Bennett and several others sat with tired but determined faces. The events of the full moon night still hung heavy in the room. For hours they talked. The unfair clauses in Marcus's agreements were laid bare. Voices rose and fell, but Ellie guided the conversation with quiet strength, reminding them they were not there to destroy one another, but to save the valley they all loved. By midday, new terms were agreed upon. Debts were restructured fairly. Water rights and access roads would no longer be used as weapons. Most importantly, they established the Willow Ridge Cooperative, a shared system of night watches, fence repairs, lambing support, and wool transport to market. Everyone would contribute according to their ranch size, and leadership would rotate each year. Marcus signed last. He looked older, wearier. "I thought control would protect me," he said quietly. "I was wrong." 2 weeks later, he sold most of his holdings at fair prices and left the valley without ceremony. As spring slowly returned to Montana, the cooperative proved its worth. When wolves tested the ridges again, the shared watch system caught them early. Neighbors rode to help within minutes. No ranch stood alone. Ellie's flock thrived, and for the first time in years, the valley felt alive with cooperation instead of fear. Caleb became a constant, gentle presence in Ellie's life. He worked beside her daily, learning the land from both her and Ghost. The big Mustang had fully accepted him, often carrying them together during evening rides along the fences. Their love grew slowly and deeply through shared sunrises, quiet conversations under the stars, and the simple comfort of knowing someone truly understood their heart. One warm evening in late spring, Ellie and Caleb stood together on the northern ridge. Ghost grazed nearby, his steel-gray coat shining in the golden light. New lambs dotted the pastures like white blossoms. The mountains were shedding their snow, and the creek ran high and bright. Caleb took Ellie's hand. "I never expected any of this," he said softly. "Not the cooperative, not Ghost, and certainly not falling in love with you." Ellie leaned into him, feeling the steady warmth of his presence. "Ghost brought us together," she replied. "He taught me that real strength isn't about fighting alone. It's about trust, patience, and choosing to stand with others. He showed me the way, and you walked it with me." Ghost lifted his head and looked at them as if understanding more than any horse should. He had come to them broken and wild, and in return had guarded not only their flock but their hearts as well. In the months that followed, the valley continued to heal. The older women, especially Grace Thompson, became the steady heart of the cooperative, offering wisdom earned through many hard seasons. Caleb grew in confidence and responsibility, and Ellie found a peace she had not known since her father's passing, a peace built on community and love. On a quiet autumn evening, exactly 1 year after that fateful torchlit night, Ellie stood at the same fence line where it had all begun. The air smelled of turning leaves and wood smoke. Ghost pressed warmly against her side as Caleb walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "The valley looks different now," he murmured. "It does," Ellie agreed. "Stronger, kinder, ours." She thought of the frightened young woman who once stood alone against 23 torches. She thought of the wild Mustang who had refused to abandon her. And she thought of the young man who had chosen courage and love over fear. Ghost let out a soft, contented snort and gazed out over the land they had all fought to protect. In his dark eyes reflected the quiet truth they had learned: the strongest protection often came not from power or wealth, but from patience, community, and the courage to trust. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting Willow Ridge in soft purples and warm golds, Ellie leaned back into Caleb's embrace. The future would always hold challenges. Winters would come. Wolves would test the ridges, but they would face them together. Ghost took a few steps forward, standing tall against the colorful sky, a silent guardian, watching over a valley that had finally remembered how to stand united. And in that golden light, Ellie Whitaker felt something she had searched for her whole life, a deep and lasting peace, the kind that only comes when love, trust, and home all exist in the same place.